Pandita Ramabai. Pandita is a title, but Ramabai comes about in the second half of the 1800s in India. She is born into a Brahmin family, meaning that is the highest caste, but the highest social class. But she was always very poor. Her parents were scholars. Her mom too, to a degree. Her parents were these great scholars of ancient Hindu texts, and would wander the country essentially as beggars, teaching, essentially teaching and preaching, and sharing their knowledge of these texts. And Ramabai, as a young girl, was of course going around with them, a young girl and her brother, and she benefited from her father saying, okay, my daughter is going to have an equal education with my son. And so he taught her all of these texts, and she became this sort of this girl wonder prodigy who would be trotted out, and she could recite long stretches of sacred texts. And yeah, this was her life for a long time, wandering around. And then she got married very young as a girl. The boy was, I believe, her brother's best friend or something like that, but he died 2 years later, leaving her a widow with a newborn child, another girl. So she had kind of a bumpy childhood, let's say. She never had a lot of money, and she moved through the world in India as a bit of a celebrity, but she was very much driven because of her intelligence, because of a lot of the constrictions upon her due to her status as a girl and her status as a widow particularly. She was driven into the reform movement, and reform in pretty much any society has some really interesting characteristics of how you argue for it that bake in a lot of the particulars of that individual and where they're coming from. And Ramabai is, I think, a very interesting example of that. And you can see this when she had a public speaking engagement. She was asked a question: what is the best method of providing teachers for girls? And her answer is, it appears to me evident that the women who are to become teachers of others should have special training for that work. Besides having a correct knowledge of their own language, they ought to be able to acquire English. Whether those training to be female teachers are married or unmarried or widows, they ought to be correct in their conduct and morals, and they ought also to be of respectable families. They ought to be provided with good scholarships. Teachers of girls also ought to have higher salaries than those of boys, as they should be of superior character and position. The students should live in their college compound so as to have their manners and habits improved, and there ought to be a large building with every appliance for the comfort of the teachers and students. They ought to have a native lady of good position over them. Mere learning is not enough. The conduct and morals of the students should be attended to. And in that, you see an awful lot going on. Morals is a priority in this. This harkens back to her understanding of operating in this British Indian society, because Britain at the time is in the high Victorian age. And in that age, stemming from the interests and predilections of the monarch, Victoria, Queen Victoria, you get a lot of emphasis on morality. She was a very proper queen, and people in that age, English people particularly in that age, were very concerned about showing good morals. And so she is speaking in this way, dropping these keywords to hook an audience, but also showing her own biases, her own predilections, her own prejudices, if you will. Because she's also talking about hierarchy. She's also talking about people of good character, but also good social standing, higher class people. Again, that rigid social structure that was very much a concern of British society at the time, particularly British upper class society at the time, particularly, and especially in a post-Marxian world, where class consciousness and class conflict was becoming more and more of a thing. The upper classes were clinging all the more rigidly to, no, that is not proper. So she is making these appeals in very specific ways to appeal to very specific people. Wealthy English women here, I would say, who are, but also English men who are interested in preserving their status quo, their way of life, and promoting their status quo and way of life into what would be seen as the rest of the British Empire at the time. Britain was an empire in the late 1800s, and India was a part of it, even though it was much larger. But Britain is trying to exercise that control, and here you can see Ramabai gratifying that a little, teasing that a little, and showing this this focus on morality, on education particularly, on self-improvement, that bringing you up from your bootstraps philosophy that was all the rage in England for throughout the Victorian era and arguably, into the modern era. So all of these characteristics are coming out in what she is trying to put out there into the world. She writes then The High-Caste Hindu Woman. This book addressed specifically to an English-speaking audience. She writes it in English. She has by now been to England, been educated in England, become a teacher in England, gone on speaking engagements in England, and is active in currying support for charitable efforts back in India. And she writes this in 1887. She is at this point about 30 years old. She's still a relatively young woman. But she is giving her readership here, and it's part of a speaking tour broadly, giving her readership an education. They love education, self-improvement, and all of that. It's so gratifying to be self-improving now, isn't it? Giving them an education in the status of women around the world, broadening their horizons, including the Hindu woman, the Indian woman within an understanding of what it means to be British, but also using it as a way of garnering the attention for of this specific demographic of generally educated or relatively educated but higher class women in England and to a degree in America, and channeling those concerns into Ramabai's homeland of India. Now, chapter 1 is just a primer on Hindu culture broadly. She knows she is swimming upstream of an awful lot of ignorance, so she needs to get everybody on board. So she writes a chapter entitled Prefatory Remarks, and they they just educate. They gather everybody together in a great rhetorical strategy. They gather everybody together into a group and say, okay, let's just go over some of the basics here. It's a good introductory moment here in terms of moving your audience where they want to go. You first have to put a foundation under them and say, okay, this is what we're talking about. I'm not going to assume knowledge. I am going to develop it with you, and we're going to share some of it together and get everybody on board with what you need to know broadly before we move into the specifics. And you can see that in the way she deals particularly with a lot of the ancient texts that shape the Indian culture. Particularly there's one she cites repeatedly, Manu, which is an ancient text about the society, about the structure of society, the rules of society, and she will point out significant points where it seems to be adhered to a little too rigidly, and other points where, well, they're actually misreading Manu and they're not adhering to him rigidly enough. So here she writes, although Manu and the other lawgivers differ greatly on many points, they all agree on things concerning women. According to this sacred law, a woman's life is divided into 3 parts, vis-a-vis first, childhood, second, youth or married life, and third, widowhood or old age. And there she is setting up the rest of the book, how women are viewed in the culture, but also how her book is going to proceed. And you can see there how a woman's life is defined in scripture is male-centered. First is childhood, where the suggestion, I would say, is fair to impute, is about the domination of the father and the role of the father, and ultimately of childhood marriage. Marriage comes in youth or married life. Again, that conflation of the two, youth and married life, reminding very explicitly that there is no young adulthood here. The second stage of your life begins when your husband enters in. So your father presumably dominates the first chunk, and then the second stage begins when a husband enters. That patriarchal chain is almost eternal. And third is widowhood or old age. Widowhood is the absence of the male figure, the absence of the controlling male presence in the household. So your life is defined again by a kind of male dominance, patriarchal system, even in a negative. So that, I think, is really significant, as well as we go through the book very slowly. Childhood, Chapter 2, is largely about the priority of women giving birth to sons, the value of motherhood broadly, but also particularly the focus in this chapter is not so much about the child as it is the adults around them. And here I think we can see a little bit of Ramabai's particular bias. Her childhood was a little unconventional, being A, taught to read, and B, sort of like wandering around from place to place all the time. That is not the experience of the vast number of children in India, even of her higher caste. So if she cannot write universally about that, she writes what she does know a little bit better, and that is the relationship of adults to children. And that's where she's really focusing on here. Perhaps at the cost of the children getting equal play in this, but it is still, I would say, an interesting set of observations laid out in this. And notice what she does here. In Western and Southern India, when a girl or a woman salutes the elders and priests, they bless her with these words: "Mayst thou have 8 sons, and may thy husband survive thee." In the form of a blessing, the deity is never invoked to grant daughters. Fathers very seldom wish to have daughters, for they are thought to be the property of somebody else. Besides, a daughter is not supposed to be of any use to the parents in the old age. although it is necessary for the continuance of the race that some girls should be born into the world, getting a little arch there, getting a little snarky, it is desirable that their number by no means should exceed that of the boys. If, unfortunately, a wife happens to have all daughters and no son, Manu authorizes the husband of such a woman to supersede her with another in the 11th year of their marriage. Again, laying out this very specific role that a woman's entire identity is about producing children and producing specifically boys. And here you can see her registering in essentially two forms of evidence: specific research into the scriptural integrity of these social rules, saying, all right, here we can see Manu says this. But also, she is bringing her own perspective significantly to this project, shaping your understanding of the textual evidence. She's not just saying, you can go and read Manu for yourself and you'll get an understanding of everything about Indian society, Hindu society, but I will just filter it a little bit. I will shape it a little bit. I will give you a way to understand it. Let me tell you how to read the evidence. She is laying out this like a court case, quite frankly. She is citing unimpeachable sources of cultural and scriptural tradition, but now she's saying, but we can look at this as well, and those are given equal weight in this. Those are treated equally, both the scriptural sources and her argument about them, her interpretation of them, come about of equal weight. And she handles this masterly. She would have been a fantastic lawyer, quite frankly. This is this is brilliant rhetoric that she is exercising and demonstrating for everybody here. She is also showing more, I would say, moralistic and pro-Western bias when she's doing so. Female infanticide, the killing of girls, though not sanctioned by religion and never looked upon as right by conscientious people, has nevertheless, in those parts of India mentioned, primarily the poorer, less developed rural parts, always that little class note, have silently passed over unpunished in society, by society in general. As early as 1802, the British government enacted laws for the suppression of this horrid crime, and more than 40 years ago, Major Ludlow, a kind-hearted Englishman, induced the semi-independent states to prohibit this custom, which the Hindu princes did by a mutual agreement not to allow any one to force the father of a girl to give more dowry than his circumstances should warrant, and to discourage extravagance as the celebration of marriages. But caste and clan prejudice could not be overcome so easily. You see the preference for the British way of life, the characterization of the kind Englishman, the characterization of the mutual guidance of the English governors with their Indian subjects, which is not necessarily so democratic as it is perhaps being presented here. But she is couching this in a way to solicit the favor, I would say, of an English reading audience rather than alienate it. She's not coming out and talking about how horrible the British colonial effort is. She is pointing out that, well, we all do get along and we all have made great progress in contrast to those other pesky, annoying, recalcitrant, rural, lower class Hindus, Indians. And the voice that's coming out is becoming more and more clear as we go. Chapter 3, Married Life, we really get the zeroing in on the particular practices that has such an emotional and, yes, at times astonishing reaction. And that is the practice of early marriage. She was a child bride herself, and that experience, I think, is fueling some of the most intense and effective writing in this book. It begins so dramatically, as you cannot deny. It is not easy to determine when the childhood of a Hindu girl ends and the marriage life begins. That is a fantastic opening. I would hope that all people can write papers with a nice, clear, direct opening sentence like that. And it has an emotional hook, because you're thinking a childhood of a girl, a childhood, and you feel protective of that, especially if you are, let's say, an older, an adult who has children. And your heart breaks for that. When you see when a girlhood, a childhood ends, that seems just so cold and dramatic that you are automatically getting your sympathies solicited there. And then it goes even further into the specifics of this system. The early marriage system, although not the oldest custom of my country, is at least 500 years older than the Christian era. According to Manu, always citing the authorities, according to Manu, 8 years is the minimum and 12 years of age the maximum marriageable age for a high-caste girl. Always the concern with the economic and cultural status hierarchy of the demographic here. The earlier the act of giving the daughter in marriage, the greater is the merit, for thereby the parents are entitled to rich rewards in heaven. A curious, almost, I would say, parallel Christianizing context here. The focus on rewards in heaven, very much a Christian preoccupation that she is addressing when she is talking to probably an English readership, an English audience. The specific reference to the Christian era. Everybody who is reading this needs to understand the position of this in context with a Christian reality. That is the reference point that we're all going to share. So understand that this is not some just newfangled thing, but that it has, in fact, some precedent before the Christian era. This goes on even longer, and so it has that kind of established weight to it. That's how she is writing this. She also celebrates the practice of women choosing their own husbands. Interesting. This comes also, curiously, I would say, right in the middle of the book. It almost seems to preference the Indian practice over the Western practices. But it could also be, I would say, a conscious effort to entice, to almost seduce Western women to support her Indian project. The idea of a pan-Indian English American sisterhood gratified by a kind of Western condescension. Women as well as men are quite free to choose their own future spouses. In Europe and America, women do choose their husbands. Not entirely at that era, but sure. A little power dynamic shift that she is alighting over and not trying to ruffle any feathers. Women do choose their own husbands, but it is considered a shame for a woman to be the first to request marriage. You don't want to appear desperate. And both men and women will be shocked equally at such an occurrence. But in India, women had equal freedom with men, and in this case at least, a woman might, without being put to shame and without shocking the other party, come forward and select her own husband. The Svayamvara, selecting husband, was quite common until as late as the 11th century AD, and even now, although very rarely, this custom is practiced by a few people. So, again, she is speaking to that English audience. You can see that constant reference to an English frame of mind viewing this, but at the same time trying to not offend. She does seem to be pointing to the English or the Indian example as the more liberal, perhaps, which could be an effort to spread that belief more in England and seek some reform there where she is now living. Maybe. But it also, I would say, is her inherent cultural nationalism, her inherent pride in her heritage, sort of rearing up a little and pushing back a little, but only after she has already laid this predicate throughout the entire first half of the book that, okay, the Western ways are the more sophisticated and we need to help the poor primitives. Here, right in the heart of it, almost buried, is this little pushback and say, well, okay, maybe we in the West have something to learn from them. A curious thing. And having it buried in the middle, that's the part where people might be skimming over the most pages, but also it lays an awful lot of preparation ahead of time so that sudden suggestion doesn't seem so violent. It's like, okay, she's pushing back a little, but she's really very pro-Western. A reader might think these things. And at the same time, it gives her the entire back half of the book to double up on the effort of convincing people that she is pro-Western and not taking any unfair shots. And so that by the time they get to the back of the book, the end of the book, that little pushback has been forgotten. The situational placing of this criticism, I think, is significant and also brilliant. She would be a fan-damn-tastic lawyer, which is almost a nasty thing to say. Throughout the book, you can see her citing all of these scriptural sources, all of these authorities. She is very much arguing from a position of authority, of the established culture in any given setting, be it English, American, or Indian. So she is constantly citing scripture. She is constantly showing, look, I'm not just taking pot shots from the outside. I am part of the establishment. She is a high caste woman. And you can see her going and mixing in with these scriptural sources, these unimpeachable scriptural sources, as I mentioned before, her own observations. And these come in the forms very often of anecdotes, anecdotal evidence. There is specific textual evidence, which you can go in very old books and look up, and then there is anecdotal evidence. You know, a guy told me this story, or I met this person and they told me this, or I saw this myself. And you see this again and again and again. I know of a woman in the Bombay presidency who is married to a Brahmin according to this form, saying it's not just written down, it's not just the textual constitutional makeup of society, but this is my experience of that. And she is validating that equally with the scripture. She can point to these big, heavy books that have been handed down through centuries and millennia as authorities, but she is lifting her own voice, her own experience, her own perspective in conjunction with that, almost rivaling it and at times pushing back against it. This is a classic element of rhetoric, but it also shows her willingness to challenge the traditions, to challenge the society, and to push back, as it were, against against the entire culture that has been organized in a patriarchal form to hold her down. Not necessarily in the hierarchical form. She's okay with that, and she knows not to play that card anyway because she's speaking generally to upper class women around the world, in the English speaking world. And so she shapes her audience very much with these prescriptions, these criteria in mind. Although Manu has distinctly said that 24 years is the minimum marriageable age for a young man, the popular custom defies the law. Boys of 10 and 12 are now doomed to be married to girls of 7 and 8 years of age. A boy of a well-to-do family does not generally remain a bachelor after 17 or 18 years of age. The respectable but very good poor families, even if they are of a high caste, like hers, cannot afford to marry their boys so soon, but even among them it is a shame for a man to remain unmarried after 20 or 25. Boys as well as girls have no voice in the selection of their spouses at the first marriage, but if a man lose his first wife and marries a second time, he has a voice in the matter. She is pointing out where the culture, specifically the scriptural descriptions of culture, maybe fall short in practice. And she is doing what a good anthropologist does, a good journalist does, is saying, well, okay, I'm told that society is supposed to be like this, but now I look at it and it's a little different. It doesn't always add up. And again, with that consciousness of your readership being largely very proper Victorian English aristocrats who are very concerned with form and piety and social propriety, showing or pointing out that, well, this is a deviation from Scripture, that would send signals of, okay, this is something that we need to look into. This even extends, I would say, to, at another point, the afterlife. On the subject of damnation, although no law has ever said so, the popular belief is that a woman can have no salvation unless she is formally married. It is not, then, a matter of wonder that parents become extremely anxious when their daughters are over 8 or 9 or are unsought in marriage. Very few suitors offer to marry the daughters of poor parents, though they may be of high-caste families, which is her status. She was of a high-caste Brahmin family, but she was dirt poor. So you can see her particular perspective, her POV, shining through here, where she is arguing for a particular group, her group, not necessarily universally. She doesn't address the problems of poverty much at all in this book. And so it is significant, I would say, that she is voicing this particularly here, but only in the context of those high caste people who also happen to have no money, which is another way of pushing back, I would say, or at least soliciting the support of an English audience raised in a Victorian era who are all aristocrats perhaps, but also, think about this, aristocrats in a post-industrial age where the aristocrats might have great names to them, even great estates, but they're all cash poor. They're all highly in debt, and they are getting bought out slowly and overshadowed financially and controlled economically by the rising merchant class. And so there is that resentment there. But at the same time, she may be addressing to a degree as well the wealthy merchant class women who feel a little resentment and frustration with the standards that they are meant to live by, the subjugation they are meant to experience by being commoners who make money as opposed to the landed gentry of the time. You can see Ramabai playing all of these elements against one another as she is writing. She is threading a very specific course in her project here. Above all, I would say we can see Ramabai offering something very precious here in her particular framing of her society through a woman's point of view. And you see this again and again in her consideration of the women's role, particularly within marriage. And I don't think we have to say that this was not something that gets a lot of ink, as they would say, in that era. When the time to conclude the marriage ceremony draws near, the Hindu mother's affection for the girl frequently knows no bounds. She indulges her in endless ways, knowing that in a few days her darling will be torn away from her loving embrace. Torn away is just heartbreaking. Again, an emotional appeal there. When she goes to pay the customary visit to her child's future mother-in-law, many are the tearful entreaties and soul-stirring solicitations that she will be as kind and forbearing toward the little stranger as though she were her own daughter. The boy's mother is moved at this time, for she has a woman's heart, and she promises to be a mother to the little bride. On the day fixed for the marriage, parents formally give their daughter away to the boy. Afterwards, the young people are united by priests who utter the sacred texts and pronounce them man and wife in the presence of the sacred fire and the relatives and friends. The marriage being thus concluded, it is henceforth indissoluble. Notice the focus on the women. Notice the focus on the girls, on the mothers-in-law, on the female perspective in this. The character and positioning of the female voice in society is laser sharp. The boys are only referenced in particular relationship to the girls, to the women, and the specifics of it are all about the dynamics of the female frame, of the female significance. So the perspective is unique. You just don't find that everywhere. You just don't find that in very many places at all throughout that culture. And this is valuable from an educational standpoint. This is also valuable in learning how to do this, how to frame an argument, how to take a vast amount of information and pick out what you want, because you have a clear understanding of your goal. You have a clear understanding of what you want to do in presenting this information. You're not just dumping an encyclopedia on someone. You are picking out what data points are of value for convincing people of your argument, for marshaling support for your perspective. And Ramabai is doing that so masterfully here. Ramabai is using a vast amount of information to impress upon her readers exactly what her concern is. Her concern is the women of a particular situation in a very particular period of time, and trying to motivate other women of fairly different situations, but a similar time and a similar status or perspective as women, and motivating them to help the Hindu women. And that is how this entire book plays out. The entire book is an argument for doing that. The book ends with a chapter 7, called The Appeal. She is appealing directly for money. And you can see where her focus is in this, because now she has to, after laying out all of her evidence, laying out all of her arguments, she brings it back to her core argument, her closing argument, her closing statement to the jury, if you will, where she focuses exactly on what she needs. Mothers and fathers, compare your condition of your own sweet darlings at your happy firesides with that of millions of little girls in a corresponding age in India, who have already been sacrificed to the unholy altar of inhuman social custom. And then ask yourselves whether you can stop short of doing something to rescue the little widows from the hands of their tormentors. Millions of heartrending cries are daily rising from within the stony walls of Indian zenanas. Thousands of child widows are annually dying without a ray of hope to cheer their hearts. And other thousands are daily being crushed under the fearful weight of sin and shame, with no one to prevent their ruin by providing for them a better way. Very emotional, very stirring, making that emotional appeal. All of the pretense of anthropology and an objective laying out of facts and culture are gone here. This is them just trying to make a tearful, heart-wrenching ask of their readers. Very specifically, she addresses mothers specifically. I think she is addressing this in a female frame. Everything about it is very female, female, female. She talks about the paternalism of their hearts, of the British Empire towards the Indian, the poor Indian subculture. And that sense of it is our duty. Duty is very big in the Victorian English tradition. It is their duty to help these people. But it's not even said that explicitly. It is just couched in this heart-rending mode so that the people who are then moved can then say, oh, I am so moved. I want to be a good person. I will reach out and try and help. I will donate money. I will become active politically in this organization. I will help set up a charity organization. I will participate in that charity organization. I will do something, something, something to help this. And that is what Ramabai wants. She was a highly effective advocate for her cause. Charitable organizations sprung from her work made her the most effective channel for Western philanthropic contribution into India of her time, and really throughout the 20th century until you get to Mother Teresa. And at the same time, her writings in her native language, she wrote also in her native language, roughly, she wasn't as fluent in that, it brought an extraordinary awareness to Indians of the wider world, help smooth those relationships for empire. And you can fault her if you want for promoting empire then at that point. Or you can just look at, well, that is the larger picture, but what she was focused on was just making the lives of these English women and girls a little bit better. She had a goal. She knew what she wanted to do, and she went out and marshaled all of the information she had at her disposal towards accomplishing that goal. To get British and American women and their money and their husbands' money to change and reform a culture that was honestly much older than either of theirs. And that is admirable in its way. And you have to look at that and say, well, okay, that is admirable for that. But the larger question for me is, how can I use these same tactics, these same techniques, these same rhetorical devices and strategies to make my own contribution, to change things the way I want, to argue that I see a better way and we should all gather together and try and bring that into effect.